The auctioneer's voice was dry as dust, cracking over the weary crowd. Most of the real business was done. The cattle were sold, the horses were gone, and now the dregs of the day were on display. Men leaned against posts, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt, their eyes glazed with boredom. They weren't looking at livestock anymore. Tethered to the center post was a woman. She wasn't small or delicate. She was tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of a hard life. Her hair was a tangled storm cloud, a wild mane that had clearly never known the kindness of a comb. Her dress was a collection of rags stitched together, and her hands, resting by her sides, looked strong enough to break things. They called her the Mountain Woman. Said she'd been found living up in the high ridges, a solitary creature trapping and hunting just to stay alive. A ghost from the wilderness, dragged down into the world of men. $3, the auctioneer barked, his voice straining. That's all I'm asking. $3 for a hard worker, strong back, eats little, and don't talk much. Who'll give me $3? A few men chuckled, nudging each other with their elbows. Their whispers were crude, ugly things that Luke Avery did his best to ignore. He hadn't come to town for this. He'd come for simple things, fence wire, seed corn, maybe a cheap mule if the price was right. His life was about fence wire and seed corn now. It was about survival. He thought of his 2 children back at the ranch. Sam, just 9 years old, trying so hard to be the man of the house, his small face already etched with a seriousness that broke his father's heart. And little June, barely 6, who still woke up in the night, crying for her mother. Luke's wife, Clara, had been gone for almost a year. The silence in their small cabin had grown into a living thing, a heavy presence that smothered the sound of laughter. Chores piled up like snowdrifts in winter, endless and overwhelming. The land didn't care about his grief. It was a merciless beast that only knew how to take. $3! The auctioneer called out again, his voice dripping with desperation. He just wanted to be done. Somebody, anybody, take her off my hands. The world seemed to slow down. Luke saw the woman lift her head, just slightly. For a second he could see the stubborn set of her jaw, the straight line of her back. She wasn't broken. She was just waiting. And without thinking, without any logical reason at all, Luke Avery raised his hand. I'll take her, he said, his voice quiet but clear in the sudden hush. A ripple of shock went through the remaining men. Luke Avery, the widower from up on the ridge, the man who kept to himself, buying the wild woman? No one else made a move. No one else wanted her. Sold! The auctioneer slammed his palm down on the wooden table, the sound cracking like a gunshot. To the widower, for $3. Luke walked forward, his boots heavy on the packed earth. He avoided the curious, mocking stares of the other men and pressed the 3 worn coins into the auctioneer's sweaty palm. The woman turned her head then, and for the first time, he saw her eyes. They were the color of a stormy sky, sharp and intelligent and watchful. They weren't the eyes of a wild animal. They were the eyes of a survivor. The auctioneer untied the rough rope from the post and thrust the end toward Luke. She's all yours now, Avery. Good luck. The laughter that followed them was a bitter sound, but Luke ignored it. He led the woman away from the auction block, expecting her to stumble or resist. She did neither. She just walked beside him, her long strides nearly matching his own, her head held high. She wasn't ashamed. When they reached his wagon, he stopped and turned to her. He had to ask. He didn't even know what to call her. You got a name? She was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Then, in a voice as rough as gravel scraped over stone, she spoke a single word. Mara. Luke Avery froze. His blood ran cold. The coins in his pocket suddenly felt like stones dragging him down into the earth. It couldn't be. It was impossible. He hadn't heard that name in 15 years. Not since he'd buried a part of himself he swore he'd never dig up again. But there it was. Mara. a ghost from another life, standing right in front of him. And in that moment, Luke knew his world. The small, broken world he'd been trying to hold together was about to shatter into a million pieces. The ride home was a long, rattling journey into silence. The wagon wheels groaned over the rutted road, a mournful sound that echoed the turmoil in Luke's own mind. Mara sat on the bench beside him, a statue carved from secrets. Her hands were folded in her lap, her gray eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she were looking for something she'd lost long ago. Luke couldn't stop the name from echoing in his head. Mara. 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 It was a name from before Clara, before the ranch, before the children, before the man he had become. It was from a time when he was younger, wilder, a man who thought he could outrun his own shadow. He'd been wrong. His shadow had just found him, standing at an auction block, and it had cost him $3. By the time the ranch came into view, the sun was a bleeding wound on the horizon, painting the sky in angry shades of orange and red. The cabin looked smaller than ever, a lonely outpost against the vast, unforgiving land. Sam was out front, splitting kindling with an axe that was far too big for his 9-year-old frame. He dropped it with a clang when he saw the wagon, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. A moment later, June came running from the porch, her bare feet slapping against the wood, her blonde curls bouncing as she cried out, "Pa!" Luke climbed down, his body aching with a weariness that had nothing to do with the long ride. He forced a gruff tone into his voice, trying to pretend this was normal. "Got someone to help around here," he said, motioning toward the wagon. "Her name's Mara. She'll be staying." Sam just stared. He looked from his father to the strange, tall woman, his expression a mixture of fear and defiance. June, sensing the tension, hid behind her father's leg, peeking out with wide, curious eyes. Mara didn't say a word. She simply nodded once, a curt, formal gesture. Then, with an easy grace that surprised Luke, she turned and lifted a 50-pound sack of feed from the back of the wagon. She swung it onto her shoulder as if it weighed nothing at all. Sam's eyes widened, a flicker of grudging respect in them. But he stayed silent. He was his father's son, after all. He knew how to keep his thoughts to himself. That night, the cabin felt different. The silence was still there, but now it was charged with questions. After the chores were done and the children were tucked into their pallets by the fire, Luke sat at the small wooden table, staring at the woman across from him. The lamplight cast long, dancing shadows on her face, making it impossible to read her expression. "You're not from around here," he finally said. It was a statement, not a question. Her stormy eyes lifted to meet his. "You know I'm not." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air crept down Luke's spine. He'd known her once, or thought he had. A younger girl, fierce and full of fire, who had disappeared from his life without a trace. "Why?" he asked, his voice low. "Why'd you let them sell you? A woman like you?" She didn't flinch. Her gaze was as steady as the mountains she was named for. "Because $3 is better than starving," she said, her voice still rough, but with an edge of steel he remembered. "And because I wanted to see if you'd remember me." Luke's breath hitched in his throat. The carefully constructed walls he'd built around his past began to crumble. Memories he had buried deep beneath years of grief and hard labor started to stir. A younger man, reckless and selfish. A woman who had seen the darkness in him and had been smart enough to walk away. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but before a single word could escape, a loud, sharp rap sounded on the cabin door. Luke shot to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nobody ever knocked on his door, not after dark, not out here. His hand instinctively went to the hunting rifle hanging by the hearth. He crossed the small room in 3 long strides and yanked the door open, ready for anything. Anything except the man standing on his porch. The man was smiling, but it was the smile of a wolf. A smile that didn't come close to reaching his cold, calculating eyes. "Well now, Avery," the man drawled, stepping over the threshold without waiting for an invitation. "Didn't think I'd ever find you out here in the middle of nowhere." And look at this. His eyes swept the room, lingering on the two sleeping children, and then they landed on Mara. The wolf's smile widened, lighting up with a cruel, possessive recognition. Luke's stomach turned to ice. "Well now," the man said again, his voice dropping to a soft, dangerous whisper that sent a shiver down Luke's spine. "Ain't this just a perfect little reunion?" The man in the doorway was a ghost from the same past that had brought Mara back to him. His name was Eli Ward, and he filled the small cabin with a sense of dread that was thicker than the night outside. He wore his dust-covered coat like a second skin, and his grin was a weapon, sharp and ready to draw blood. Luke's hand, which had been halfway to the rifle, dropped to his side. Showing fear to a man like Eli was like showing a shark you were bleeding. It only made him more eager for the kill. "Didn't know you'd settled down, Luke," Eli drawled, his eyes taking in the sparse room, the worn-out furniture, the children's small boots lined up neatly by the door. It was a calculated inventory, a predator assessing its territory. His gaze finally settled back on Mara, who sat as still and silent as a stone. "Mara," Eli said, savoring the name, rolling it around on his tongue like a fine whiskey. "Didn't think I'd ever have the pleasure of seeing you again either." Mara's jaw was a tight, hard line. She said nothing. Her silence was a defiance all its own. Luke's mind was spinning, trying to connect the dots. Mara, the woman he'd just bought for $3, and Eli Ward, the man he'd run from 15 years ago. And they knew each other. The world was shrinking, and it was closing in around him. "What do you want, Eli?" Luke asked, his voice flat and cold. He stepped forward slightly, putting himself between Eli and the table where Mara sat. Eli shrugged, spreading his hands wide as if he were just an old friend dropping by for a chat. "Just passing through," he said, the lie sliding easily from his lips. "Saw a familiar-looking wagon back in town. Figured I'd follow it and say hello." But Luke knew better. Eli Ward never just passed through. He moved with a purpose, and that purpose was always selfish, always destructive. He was a vulture who circled, waiting for something to die. The silence in the room stretched, taut as a bowstring. The only sound was the crackle of the fire in the hearth. "Nice little setup you've got here, Avery," Eli said at last, his eyes glinting. "2 kids, a woman. Almost like you've built yourself a new family. After the last one—" He let the words hang in the air, a deliberate poison. The mention of Clara, unspoken but understood, was a fist to Luke's gut. He took another step forward, his shadow falling over Eli. "Say what you came here to say, Eli, and then get out." Eli's smirk returned. All right. No need to get touchy." He leaned against the doorframe, casual and confident. "Word is, there are some folks up north looking for a woman named Mara. Important folks. Folks with money." Luke's chest tightened. He risked a glance at Mara. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. She didn't deny it. "She's worth a hell of a lot more than $3, Avery," Eli continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And you and I both know how tight money's been for you since you buried your wife." That was the second jab, and it hit just as hard as the first. Luke didn't move, didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "Get out," Luke said again, his voice dangerously quiet. Eli tilted his head, his eyes mocking. "Are you sure? Think about your kids, Luke. This land, it eats men like you alive. I'm offering you a way out, a clean break. You give me the woman, I give you a share, and I disappear from your life forever." Luke's jaw locked so tight his teeth ached. "I said, get out." The smirk finally vanished from Eli's face. The charming facade dropped away, revealing the cold, hard predator beneath. He stepped forward, the air around him growing darker, colder. "You always did think you were better than me, didn't you, Avery? But we're the same, you and I. We know how to take what we want." Suddenly, the scrape of a chair against the floorboard shattered the tension. Mara stood up. She was tall, almost as tall as Luke, and in the flickering lamplight, she looked formidable. "You're not taking anything," she said. Her voice was low, but it carried the weight of thunder. Eli turned to her slowly, a new kind of interest glinting in his eyes. You always did have spirit, he mused. A damn shame you wasted it on the wrong man. He took a step toward her. Luke moved instantly, blocking his path. He was a wall of muscle and quiet rage. Eli let out a single, humorless laugh. Fine, have it your way. Keep her. He brushed past Luke, his shoulder deliberately knocking into his. He yanked the door open, letting the cold night air rush in. But before he left, he turned back, his eyes as sharp and deadly as broken glass. They'll come for her, Luke, he hissed. The men who are looking for her, they're not like me. They won't make you an offer. They'll just take her, and when they do, they'll burn this place to the ground with you and your kids inside it. You'll wish you had taken my deal. The door slammed shut, leaving a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than before. The fire popped in the hearth, a small, lonely sound in the vast, dark quiet. Luke finally turned to face Mara. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. What the hell was that about? Her face was pale in the lamplight, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if she needed it to stay upright. He's not wrong, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Not wrong about what? Her gray eyes met his, and in their depths, he saw a darkness that mirrored the wilderness she'd come from. There are people looking for me, she admitted, but it's not for the reasons he thinks. Luke waited, his every nerve ending screaming. I wasn't born in those mountains, Luke, she said, her voice gaining strength. I ran there. I ran there because the man I was supposed to marry. He wasn't just a bad man, he was a monster. I saw him murder my own brother in cold blood. And his family, they're powerful. They own judges, they own lawmen. They want me dead, not just for what I saw, but for being the only one left alive who's willing to tell the truth. The words hit Luke like a physical blow. They were cold and heavy, and they changed everything. He sank back into his chair, the room seeming to tilt around him. This wasn't just about an old rivalry with Eli Ward anymore. This wasn't about a $3 auction. He had just brought a war to his doorstep. And standing between that war and his 2 sleeping children was a woman he barely knew, a woman with a ghost in her past and a price on her head. The night offered no rest. Every creak of the old cabin, every gust of wind that howled through the pines, was the sound of approaching doom. Luke sat in his chair, rifle across his lap, watching the windows as the moon crawled across the inky sky. Across the room, Mara didn't sleep either. She sat by the dying embers of the fire, sharpening a long hunting knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The scrape of stone on steel was a steady, unnerving rhythm in the quiet dark. She was preparing for a fight she knew was coming. Dawn broke gray and cold, the light barely filtering through the grimy windows. Sam was the first to stir, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he sat up on his pallet. Pa? He whispered, his voice small in the heavy silence. Luke held a finger to his lips. Go wake your sister, he said quietly. Get your boots on, now. Mara looked up from her knife, her eyes catching the first light. You think he'll be back? Luke's face was grim. Eli doesn't walk away from a prize. And if he can't have you, he'll make sure no one can. If he said they're coming, they're coming. By the time the sun had fully crested the hills, the ranch was a flurry of grim activity. Luke saddled the 2 horses they had, his movements swift and practiced. He packed what little food they could carry, some dried meat, a sack of cold biscuits. Sam, his small face a mask of determination that was far too old for his years, helped load the rifles into the wagon, his hands surprisingly steady. June, sensing the fear that hung in the air like smoke, clung to Mara's hand, her eyes wide and silent. As Luke tightened the last strap on the wagon, he took a moment to look out across his land. The fields he'd plowed, the fences he'd mended, the cabin where his children had been born. Leaving it felt like another kind of death, another piece of himself being ripped away. But he'd buried enough family on this land. He wouldn't bury any more. They set out before the morning mist had burned off the valley, the wagon wheels creaking a soft protest as they rolled over the frozen ground. Mara rode beside Luke on the wagon bench again, but this time, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. Her gray eyes, no longer just watchful, were now actively scanning the horizon, searching for threats. "This is my fault," she said, her voice low, almost carried away by the wind. "No," Luke replied, his voice firm. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "This is Eli's fault, and it's the fault of whoever is riding with him." She didn't argue, but her hands, resting in her lap, were clenched into tight fists. The hours passed in a heavy, anxious silence. Every bend in the trail, every dark patch of trees, felt like an ambush waiting to happen. The land that had once been his home now felt like enemy territory. And then, trouble found them. The first shot was a sharp, vicious crack that split the still air. It splintered the wooden wagon rail right beside Luke's head, sending a spray of sharp wood fragments against his cheek. Sam screamed from the back of the wagon. June dove for cover, her small body trembling as she clung to Mara. "Down!" Luke roared, snapping the reins hard. The horses, terrified by the sound, lurched forward, their eyes rolling in panic. Shapes broke from the tree line ahead. 3 riders, their faces covered with bandanas, their guns raised and glinting in the morning sun. They were closing in fast. Mara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the rifle that lay between them, spun around on the bench, and fired. The sound was deafening. One of the riders reeled back, clutching his arm as his horse bucked and shied away. Another shot tore through the canvas cover of the wagon, inches from where Sam's head had been just a moment before. Luke urged the horses on, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew this trail. He knew every twist and turn. He steered the wagon hard toward the river bend, a place where the trail narrowed, where the rocky terrain might give them a sliver of a chance. "Hold on!" he shouted, his voice nearly lost in the thunder of hooves and the screaming of the wagon wheels. The wagon hit a deep rut, lurching violently. It tilted, threatening to tip over completely. June screamed again, a thin, terrified sound. Behind them, the 2 remaining riders were gaining. They were pushing their horses hard, their intentions clear. Luke's stomach plummeted as he saw where the trail was leading them. He'd made a terrible mistake. The path didn't just narrow, it ended. It ended at a steep, sheer bluff that dropped straight down into the churning, icy river below. And the horses, wild with fear, weren't stopping. The bluff loomed before them, a wall of rock and empty air. The wagon wheels screamed in protest as they skidded over loose stone. Luke pulled back on the reins with all his might, his muscles straining, but the panicked horses were beyond his control. Their hooves scraped and slid on the frozen ground, fighting for purchase that wasn't there. The edge was rushing toward them. 10 more feet. 5. Then Mara was moving. In a single, fluid motion, she threw herself off the moving wagon bench. She didn't jump clear. She launched herself at the horses, grabbing the bridle of the lead animal with both hands. "Whoa!" she roared, her voice a raw, powerful command that cut through the chaos. The horse reared up, its eyes rolling white with terror, muscles straining against her grip. But Mara held on. She dug her heels into the rocky earth, a woman born of mountains, every muscle in her arms and back standing out in sharp relief as she fought to drag 2,000 pounds of panicked horse and dead weight back from the abyss. The wagon pitched sideways, one wheel lifting clear off the ground. Sam screamed, clutching June to his chest, shielding her with his small body. "Mara!" Luke bellowed. He leaped from his seat, not to safety, but to the tilting side of the wagon. He threw his shoulder against the wooden frame, his boots skidding in the dirt, adding his own weight to the desperate struggle. With one final monumental heave, Mara wrenched the horse's head around. The team stumbled backward a single crucial step. It was just enough. Luke slammed his weight down, and the wagon crashed back onto all four wheels, mere inches from the crumbling edge of the cliff. For a single, breathless moment, everything was still. The horses stood trembling, their sides heaving. Luke's lungs burned. Then another shot rang out. The bullet smashed into the wagon bed, sending splinters flying. Mara spun around, the rifle already back in her hands. She fired in one smooth, practiced motion, not even seeming to aim. The nearest rider's hat flew from his head as he instinctively ducked, his horse veering wildly away. Luke vaulted back onto the driver's bench, snapping the reins. The horses, their terror of the cliff now replaced by the terror of the guns, lurched forward again, this time away from the edge, pounding back down the rocky path. The two riders regrouped with terrifying speed. One broke wide, trying to flank them, while the other charged straight up the middle, his gun blazing. "Sam, under the tarp! Hold on to your sister!" Luke shouted. The boy didn't hesitate. He pulled June down with him, disappearing under the canvas just as another bullet ripped through it. Mara fired again. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but she didn't flinch. Her shot was true. It hit the lead rider's horse in the flank. The animal screamed and went down hard, crashing sideways into a tangle of thorny scrub and rock. One left, but he was smart. He rode hard and fast, cutting ahead, aiming for the narrow pass that Luke had been trying to reach earlier. "He's trying to box us in!" Mara shouted over the wind. Luke's jaw was clenched. He knew this land like the back of his hand, but he'd never had to navigate it like this, with a heavy wagon and two children in the back. He made a split-second decision. He snapped the reins and steered the horses hard, away from the pass and down toward the river crossing. The water would be deep and freezing. The current would be fast, but it was their only chance. The wagon thundered down the steep embankment, wheels bouncing over exposed roots and loose stones. The river came into view, a wide, churning expanse of gray water with mist rising from its surface like ghostly hands. Behind them, the hoofbeats were closing in. Luke didn't have time for second thoughts. He drove the team straight into the shallows. A huge splash of ice-cold water erupted, drenching them instantly. The horses screamed, fighting the shock of the cold and the pull of the current, but Luke urged them on. Their muscles strained as the wagon groaned under the strain, the river trying to claim it. Mara, her fingers surprisingly steady despite the cold and the violent shaking of the wagon, reloaded the rifle. She fired again, the shot echoing strangely across the water. The last rider's horse panicked as the deep water swallowed its hooves, and it veered off, fighting to get back to the safety of the bank. But the rider was determined. He fought his horse, his eyes blazing with a furious resolve. He was going to cut them down, even if it meant they all drowned in the process. Luke pushed the horses harder. The water was rising, seeping into the wagon bed, soaking the tarp where Sam and June huddled in the dark. The wheels ground against unseen rocks beneath the surface, the sound a horrifying screech of tortured wood and metal. Every second threatened to tear the axle free and leave them stranded. "Almost there!" Luke shouted, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince them or himself. Mara fired her last round. The shot was a miracle. It hit the rifle in the man's hands, knocking it from his grasp. He cursed, hauling his horse back as the terrified animal flailed in the rushing water. They were almost to the other side. Luke could see the muddy bank just ahead. And then the wagon jolted to a violent, bone-jarring halt. One of the wheels had slammed against a submerged boulder. The axle groaned, and then there was a sickening crack of splintering wood. They were stuck. "Luke!" Mara yelled, her voice sharp with alarm. He whipped the reins, roaring at the horses, pouring every ounce of strength and desperation he had into his arms. The wheel caught again, scraped against the rock, and then, with a final, shuddering lurch, it broke free. The wagon surged up the far bank, water cascading from its sides. Luke didn't stop. He didn't dare look back until they had put 100 yards of solid ground between them and the river. When he finally risked a glance over his shoulder, the opposite bank was empty. The rider was gone. For now. They didn't stop until the battered wagon had carried them 3 more miles into the wilderness, groaning and creaking with every turn of its damaged wheels. Luke finally pulled the exhausted team into a dense stand of pines, allowing the horses to rest. Steam rose from their trembling coats in the chill air, their breath coming in harsh, ragged clouds. Sam crawled out from under the wet tarp, soaked to the bone and shivering, but his hand was clutched tightly around June's. "You okay?" Luke asked, his voice rough with emotion. Sam nodded, his teeth chattering too hard to speak. June just buried her face in her brother's chest, refusing to look at the cold, gray world around them. Mara slid down from the wagon, water streaming from the hem of her tattered skirt. She went to the horses first, running a gentle hand along their trembling necks, her touch calming and sure. Only after she'd checked on the animals did she turn to Luke. "We can't keep running like this," she said, her voice flat and certain. "Not with the children. Not with a wagon that leaves a trail a blind man could follow." Luke rubbed a hand over his tired, gritty face. "We can't go home either. Eli will be waiting there." Mara's gray eyes met his. There was no fear in them, only a grim resolve. "Then we go where the wagon can't follow. We go higher, up into the ridges." He stared at her, the stories he'd heard at the auction coming back to him. The mountain woman, who lived alone where few men dared to tread. "You know those mountains," he said. It wasn't a question. She gave a single sharp nod. "Better than anyone." Luke took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. It was a choice, but it wasn't really a choice. It was the only move left on the board. "All right," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of their situation. "You lead the way." They traveled until dusk, abandoning the wagon and carrying what little they could on their backs. The land grew rougher, the familiar paths narrowing into little more than deer trails that wound their way through the dense forest. Mara moved with a quiet, sure-footed purpose, as if the earth itself recognized her and bent to her will. By the time they finally made camp in a small, sheltered clearing, the sky was a black, star-dusted canvas. The children, exhausted beyond measure, were asleep almost before the fire caught and began to crackle. Luke sat across the small blaze from Mara, the flames casting dancing shadows across her sharp, angular features. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "You said they won't stop," Luke said at last, breaking the silence. "The men who are looking for you." She stared into the flames, her expression unreadable. "They won't stop until I'm dead." "Why?" he asked, needing to understand the full scope of the danger they were in. "What did you do that was so terrible?" Her jaw tightened, and she finally looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I told the truth," she said, her voice low and fierce. "And men like the one who wants me dead, they don't ever forgive a woman who refuses to stay silent." Luke didn't answer right away. He looked over at his two sleeping children, at Sam, who had curled his body protectively around his little sister, even in sleep. A cold, furious anger began to smolder in his gut. It was an anger he hadn't felt in a very long time. He looked back at Mara, at the woman he had bought for $3, the woman who had brought a war to his door. "Well," he said, his voice a low growl, "they'll have to get through me first." Mara's stormy eyes met his across the fire, and for the first time since he had laid eyes on her at that auction block, something flickered in their depths. It wasn't just defiance anymore. It was something else, something that looked a little bit like hope. But then, far off in the darkness, a lone wolf howled, a long, mournful sound that seemed to snake its way through the pine trees. Luke's hand drifted down, his fingers brushing against the cold steel of the rifle resting beside him. Because hope didn't mean you were safe. Not out here. Not anymore. The night was a long, restless vigil. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind through the pines sent a jolt of adrenaline through Luke. He stayed awake, rifle in hand, scanning the deep shadows that ringed their small campfire. Across from him, Mara never truly slept either. She sat with her back against a gnarled pine, her hunting knife resting in her lap, her eyes reflecting the firelight like a predator that had learned to survive by never, ever letting down its guard. By dawn, a thin, brittle layer of frost coated the ground. Luke rose quietly, his boots crunching softly on the frozen earth as he went to check on the horses they'd tethered nearby. One of them was favoring its front leg, a strain from the violent river crossing. It would hold for a while, but they couldn't push it hard. Mara joined him without a word. She crouched down, her skilled fingers gently feeling along the horse's tendons. "We'll have to walk the ridge slowly," she said, her voice low. "It's too steep for a lame horse and a heavy load." Luke just nodded. He wasn't used to taking orders, especially not from a woman he'd bought for $3. But there was a certainty in her voice, a deep, instinctual knowledge of the land that made it easy to follow. They broke camp quickly, the mood grim and silent. Sam, his small face set in that same heartbreakingly serious expression, insisted on carrying June on his hip, freeing up Mara to lead the one good horse. The trail ahead was a sharp, winding ascent, a series of switchbacks carved into the mountainside by deer and the occasional lone trapper. The higher they climbed, the quieter the world became. The air grew thinner, colder. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. By midday, they reached a rocky outcrop that offered a breathtaking, terrifying view of the valley below. From this height, Luke could see his entire world stretched out like a map. The silver ribbon of the river, the patchwork of pasture and timber, and far to the east, the faint, hazy smudge of the town where this whole nightmare had begun. Sam came to stand beside him, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. "Pa," he whispered, "you can see everything from up here." Luke rested a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. "Yeah," he said grimly, "but that also means they can see us. We have to keep moving." Mara had already scouted ahead, vanishing into the dense tree line like a ghost. She returned just as silently, her presence a sudden, startling thing. "There's an old trapper's cabin about half a mile up," she reported, her breath pluming in the cold air. "The roof's gone in, but the walls are solid stone. It's shelter." "Will it hide us?" Luke asked, the question hanging heavy between them. A corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. "It'll hide us," she said, "as long as no one knows where to look." They reached the cabin just as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks. It was little more than 4 low walls of stacked stone, half sunk into the earth and overgrown with moss. The roof had indeed collapsed long ago, a victim of countless heavy snows, but it was shelter from the wind, and Luke had learned very quickly not to be picky. They set about making it habitable. Mara worked with a relentless, focused energy that stunned Luke. She hauled heavy, fallen beams out of the way, beams that looked like they should have been twice her size to move. While she cleared the space, Luke cut fresh pine boughs to create a crude, makeshift roof frame. Sam, desperate to help, tried to carry loads of brush, his skinny arms straining under the weight. "Here," Mara said, her voice surprisingly gentle. She crouched beside the boy, taking a handful of the smaller branches from him. She showed him how to weave them together, lacing them in and out to create a dense, tight mat. "It's stronger this way," she explained. Sam's eyes lit up with a quiet pride as he successfully copied her movements, his small chest puffing out just a little. Luke watched them from across the clearing, a strange, complicated knot twisting in his gut. It wasn't just that Mara was strong or capable or smart. It was the way his son was looking at her, with trust, with admiration. His children, who had been so lost since their mother's death, were starting to look at this strange woman like she belonged with them. And that scared Luke Avery more than Eli Ward and a dozen men with guns ever could. By nightfall, the cabin had a new roof of woven pine boughs and stripped bark. It wouldn't keep out a heavy rain, but it would block the worst of the biting wind. The small fire they built inside the stone walls filled the cramped space with a smoky, welcome warmth. And for the first time since they had fled the ranch, Luke heard his daughter laugh. It was a soft, surprised sound, as if she had forgotten she knew how. Luke found himself watching Mara, studying her in the flickering firelight. He watched the way she coaxed a nervous June into eating a piece of dried meat. He watched the way her stormy gray eyes softened, just for a moment, when Sam proudly showed her a clumsy bird he'd carved from a piece of wood with his pocket knife. Later, after the children had fallen into an exhausted sleep, he sat beside her at the fire. The silence between them was different now, less tense, more thoughtful. "You were always like this," he said quietly, the words surprising even himself. Mara glanced at him, her expression guarded. "Like what?" "Strong," he said, looking at her calloused hands. "Like the land itself couldn't bend you." Her gaze dropped back to the flames. A log popped, sending a shower of sparks up toward the makeshift roof. "Oh, the land bent me plenty," she said, her voice low and rough. "I just learned how not to break." Luke stared at her profile, at the sharp line of her jaw, and the stubborn set of her mouth. He had known her for a few short months 15 years ago, but he was beginning to realize he hadn't really known her at all. The fragile peace was shattered sometime near midnight. Luke woke with a jolt, his senses screaming. It was the horses. They were snorting and stamping nervously just outside the cabin. Mara was already on her feet, the long hunting knife in her hand, as if it had materialized from the shadows. "Stay with the kids," Luke whispered, his heart starting to pound. He grabbed his rifle and slipped out of the low doorway into the freezing moonlit darkness. His breath plumed white in the air. The horses were skittish, their ears pricked forward, their eyes wide as they stared into the dense trees at the edge of the clearing. Then he heard it. A soft crunching sound, footsteps on frost-covered leaves. It was too slow, too careful to be an animal. "Show yourself!" Luke barked, his voice ringing out in the stillness. He raised the rifle to his shoulder. A figure stepped out from behind a thick pine tree, its hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Easy now, Avery," the man said. Luke's grip on the rifle tightened until his knuckles were white. The man's grin was a pale slash in the darkness. It was Eli. "Knew you'd run for high ground," Eli drawled, taking another casual step forward. "You always did like to look down on the rest of us." Luke kept the rifle aimed squarely at Eli's chest. But Eli didn't seem concerned. He just stood there, radiating a smug confidence. "Go ahead and shoot me, Avery. My men will cut you down before you can even think about reloading. You didn't really think I came alone, did you?" As if on cue, more shapes began to emerge from the shadows of the tree line. 4 of them. 5. 6. All armed, all watching him. Luke's stomach turned to stone. They were surrounded. "You can't win this, Luke," Eli said, his voice dropping to a soft, reasonable tone that was more terrifying than a shout. "Just hand her over, take your kids, go back to your broken-down ranch. You'll never have to see me again, I promise." Then, from the darkness of the cabin doorway behind him, Mara's voice rang out, sharp and steady as steel. "He's not handing me over to anyone." Eli's grin widened, his teeth flashing in the moonlight. "There she is," he said with mock affection. "Always picking the wrong side, always choosing the losing team." Luke instinctively shifted his position, moving closer to the cabin, closer to Mara, the rifle a steady weight in his hands. "Well then," Eli said, his voice losing all its false warmth, turning as cold and hard as the frozen ground beneath their feet. "I guess this ends the hard way." And then the night exploded in a hail of gunfire. The first shot was a deafening roar that ripped through the quiet night. Luke fired back on pure instinct, the recoil of the big rifle slamming into his shoulder. He saw one of Eli's men cry out and drop, clutching his arm. "Inside!" Luke yelled, ducking back behind the stone wall of the cabin. Sam scrambled to pull a terrified June deeper into the shadows of the small structure as bullets tore through the makeshift roof of pine boughs. Bark and needles rained down on them like a bitter confetti. Mara fired next. Her shot was clean, deliberate, and deadly. A second man collapsed into the snow without a sound. But Eli didn't even seem to be firing. He was just standing back, directing his men, that same horrible grin plastered on his face. He was enjoying this. He was savoring their terror. "Don't you worry, Avery," he shouted, his voice ringing out over the cacophony of gunfire. "After this is done, I'll make sure your kids are taken care of. I'll raise them as my own." A white-hot rage, purer and more intense than anything Luke had ever felt, burned through him. He leaned out from the broken doorway, brought the rifle to his shoulder, sighted down the long barrel, and aimed directly at Eli's smirking face. He squeezed the trigger. The bullet missed by a fraction of an inch, close enough to shave a lock of hair from Eli's head. The grin finally faltered. "You're a dead man, Avery," Eli hissed. And then the world erupted. It seemed like all of Eli's men opened fire at once, a relentless, sustained barrage that chewed at the stone walls and splintered the doorframe. Inside the cabin, June screamed as a bullet slammed into the log wall just inches from her head. Sam, with a courage that defied his years, threw his small body over hers, shielding her, his hands trembling but his jaw clenched in a furious defiance. Mara was low to the ground, reloading with a speed and efficiency that was mesmerizing. She moved like someone who had done this 100 times before, like danger was the air she breathed. "Luke!" she shouted over the noise. "We can't hold them off from here! We're trapped!" He fired 2 more quick shots, then ducked back as a fresh volley of bullets tore the doorway to shreds. "Where can we go?" Mara's eyes, glinting in the firelight, flicked to the back wall of the cabin, the one that was built directly against a steep, rocky drop-off into the dark trees below. "We jump," she said, her voice grim. Luke stared at her as if she were insane. "That's a 20-foot drop, maybe more." "It's better than staying here to die," she retorted. Without waiting for his agreement, she slung her rifle over her shoulder, scooped up a crying June, and held the little girl tight against her chest. "Sam, stay with your pa!" she barked, her voice a sharp command. Luke didn't have time to argue. He fired one last round toward the tree line to give them cover, then turned, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from his chest. He grabbed Sam, lifting his son into his arms. He met Mara's eyes over the heads of his children. "Go!" he yelled. Mara took a deep breath and kicked at the loose stones of the back wall. It gave way with a shower of dirt and rock. The last thing Luke saw before he followed her into the abyss was the look on Eli's face, illuminated by a muzzle flash. It was a mask of pure, thwarted rage, his teeth bared like a wolf's. Then they were falling, tumbling through the darkness, branches whipping at their faces, the cold air rushing past them. The ground came up to meet them with a brutal, unforgiving impact. And then everything went black. Pain was the first thing to claw its way back into his consciousness. Not a sharp, clean pain, but a dull, relentless ache that had settled deep in his ribs and radiated through his entire body. Luke's eyes fluttered open to a world of gray light and the muted sound of wind sighing through pine trees. He was on his back, half buried in a soft, damp bed of pine needles and melting snow. His coat was torn, and he was soaked through with an icy chill that went straight to the bone. For a disoriented moment, he couldn't remember what had happened. Then it came rushing back in a dizzying flood of images. The gunfire, Mara's desperate shout, the weight of Sam in his arms, the sickening sensation of falling. He sat up with a gasp, the movement sending a bolt of white-hot agony through his side. He'd cracked a rib, maybe 2. It didn't matter. He twisted around, his eyes frantically searching the dense underbrush. "Sam!" he called out, his voice a raw, desperate croak. A weak cough answered him from about 10 feet away. Luke scrambled forward, ignoring the fire in his side, his hand stinging from the cold. He found Sam huddled behind a large, moss-covered rock. There was a shallow, bloody gash on his forehead, but he was awake. He was alive. The boy's eyes, wide with panic, met his. "June," Sam whispered, his voice hoarse with terror. "Where's June?" Luke's gut clenched into a tight, cold knot. "I don't know, son," he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I don't—" Then he heard it, A new sound. Footsteps, crunching fast but steady through the snow and broken branches of the forest floor. He turned, his hand automatically reaching for the rifle that was no longer there, and he froze. A figure emerged from between two large pine trees. It was Mara. Her braid had come undone, her hair a wild tangle around her face. There was a streak of mud down one cheek, and the sleeve of her shirt was soaked in dark crimson blood. But in her arms, wrapped tightly against her chest, was June. Luke didn't think. He lurched toward them, stumbling, his legs weak with relief. He dropped to his knees in the snow as they reached him. June stirred in Mara's arms, letting out a small, frightened whimper. "She's okay," Mara rasped, her own voice strained with pain and exhaustion. "Just hit her head in the fall. She's scared, but she's okay." Luke reached out a trembling hand, gently stroking June's hair. His daughter blinked up at him, her eyes clouded with confusion, but she was conscious. She was breathing. A wave of relief so powerful it was physically painful crashed over him, and he nearly doubled over. But Mara didn't allow herself a moment of rest. "We need to move," she said, her voice sharp, pulling him back to the grim reality of their situation. "Now!" Luke nodded, pushing himself to his feet and helping a shaken Sam to do the same. From high above them, on the ridge they had just jumped from, they could hear the faint sound of men shouting. "They found the cabin," Luke muttered, his jaw tight. "It won't take them long to figure out where we went." Mara's eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the rugged terrain around them. "There's a ravine up ahead," she said, pointing. "It's narrow, steep. If we can get there, we can lose them in it." "How far?" 2 miles, maybe less." Sam, though he was limping slightly, leaned into his father's side, his small face set with a renewed resolve. "I can do it, Pa," he said, his voice quiet but firm. So they moved, fast and quiet, a broken family of 4 fleeing through a hostile wilderness. They skirted between the thick trunks of ancient pines, their boots sinking into patches of snow that glittered like broken glass in the pale morning light. Every sound from behind them, a snapping twig, a dislodged rock, made Luke's spine go rigid with tension. Mara led the way, even wounded, even exhausted. She never slowed, never hesitated, never looked back, and Luke, following in her footsteps, found himself watching her with a new sense of wonder. This woman he had bought for $3. This woman who now held his daughter's life in her hands, who moved through blood and ice and gunfire as if she had been forged in it. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't even fully form the thought, but something deep inside him, something he had boarded up and locked away since the day they lowered Clara into the cold ground, began to crack open. The ravine was a deep, jagged gash in the earth, its steep sides plunging down into shadow. Mara went first without hesitation, sliding down the loose scree on her heels, using one hand to brace herself against the rock face. Luke carefully passed June down to her, then helped Sam scramble down behind him. The walls of the ravine closed in around them, the air growing colder, damper. Icicles hung from stone shelves like jagged teeth, and their every footstep echoed in the enclosed space, along with the steady rhythmic dripping of melting frost. They stopped only once, ducking into a shallow cave that was little more than a hollowed-out space under a rock ledge, no bigger than an old bear's den. As Mara sank to the ground, her face pale with exhaustion, Luke reached out and pressed a hand to her arm. It was the first time he had touched her voluntarily since that first night at the ranch. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice low. "I'm aware," she replied, her voice tight with pain. "Let me see." She hesitated for a moment, then gave a slight nod. Luke carefully peeled back the torn, blood-soaked fabric of her sleeve. The wound was a deep gash along her forearm, not life-threatening, but it had bled far too much. He used the last of their clean water to wash it as best he could, then tore a long strip from the bottom of his own shirt to bind it tightly. Mara didn't flinch, not once. "How did you learn to do all this?" Luke asked as he worked, his voice quiet. The fighting, the tracking, all of it. She stared at the damp wall of the cave. I had to, she said simply. There's more to it than that. Her jaw clenched, but then a long, weary sigh escaped her lips. After my brother was murdered, she began, her voice barely a whisper. I ran. I thought I could just disappear up in the hills, live off the land. But I wasn't the only one hiding up there. I found others. Women mostly. Women running from men like the one I ran from. Some of them had stories that made mine sound like a fairy tale. Her eyes grew distant. We kept each other alive. We taught each other what the world wouldn't. We learned how to hunt, how to fight, how to be harder than the men who were hunting us. Luke looked down at her hands. They were scarred and calloused, but they were strong. They were the hands of a protector. Did you ever wonder? He asked softly, tying off the bandage. What it would have been like if we'd stayed in touch all those years ago? Mara didn't answer right away. Then she looked up at him, her gray eyes clear and unflinching. Sometimes, she admitted. But you weren't ready for someone like me back then, Luke. You were too busy running from yourself. He couldn't argue with that. He gave a single, slow nod. Maybe not. She leaned her head back against the cold stone wall, a flicker of something new in her expression. But you are now. Neither of them said anything after that. They didn't need to. The words, spoken and unspoken, hung in the cold, still air of the cave between them, as real and as solid as the mountain that surrounded them. They stayed hidden in the ravine through the rest of the day and into the long, cold night. They dared not risk a fire, so they huddled together for warmth, the silence broken only by the chattering of their teeth. Sam curled up beside June, both of them too exhausted to do anything but sleep. Mara insisted on keeping watch. Luke offered to take a turn, but she just shook her head, a grim smile touching her lips. You trust too easily, Luke Avery, she said softly. That's a luxury people like us can't afford. It's how men like Eli Ward survive. By morning, a fresh layer of snow had fallen, a pristine white blanket that covered their tracks and offered a fragile, temporary sense of safety. But Luke knew better than to be complacent. Eli was like a wolf. He wouldn't give up the hunt until his prey was dead. They moved again, climbing ever higher, up into the harsh, wind-swept country where the trees grew stunted and twisted, and the very air seemed thin and sharp in their lungs. Around midday, they reached a rocky pass, a desolate landscape of wind-scoured cliffs and jagged crags that looked like the broken teeth of some long-dead giant. Mara stopped, her head tilted, scanning the terrain with an intensity that made the hair on Luke's arms stand up. There, she said, pointing toward a jagged overhang of rock. An old mining camp. It hasn't been used in years. They scrambled up the last part of the ridge toward the dubious safety of the camp. Sam slipped once on the loose rock, his feet skidding out from under him, and he would have fallen if Luke hadn't caught him just in time. They had just reached the flat ledge of the camp when a sound broke the profound stillness of the high country. Gunfire, distant but clear and unmistakable on the thin mountain air. Luke spun around. Far below them, he could see them. A line of dark figures, slowly but steadily climbing the same ridge they had just ascended. Eli's men. There were at least 6 of them, maybe more. Mara let out a low, vicious curse. They have dogs, she said, her voice tight with fury. That's how they found our trail so fast. Luke's eyes darted around the abandoned camp. It was a pathetic collection of ruins, 2 collapsed wooden shacks, a rusted-out water drum, and the entrance to a mine shaft, its opening nearly choked with rubble and fallen timbers. We hold here, he said, his voice grim. They were too exposed to run, and the cliffs above them were too sheer to climb. This was it. This was their last stand. Mara didn't argue. She was already kneeling by the mine entrance, pulling loose, rotten boards from a broken crate. You ever make a trap, Luke? She asked, her voice all business. He raised a questioning eyebrow. Plenty, for coyotes and wolves. Why? Because she was already stuffing a tattered cloth satchel with a dark, crumbly powder she'd found in a discarded stick of dynamite. Because if we're going to die up here, she said, her eyes glinting with a cold, hard fire, we're taking some of them with us. The blast was a titanic roar that shook the very foundations of the mountain. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated fury, a voice of thunder rolling up from the bowels of the earth. The narrow trail leading to the mining camp vanished in a cascading avalanche of rock and dirt. Dust and sharp shards of stone filled the air, a choking, blinding cloud that stung Luke's eyes as he stumbled through the smoke-filled ruins of the shack. He had heard Sam scream just as the world exploded. "June! She's not breathing!" He found them huddled in the back corner of the collapsing structure. Sam was on his knees beside his sister, his face a mask of pale, shaking terror. June lay limp in his arms, her lips tinged with a terrifying shade of blue. Her small chest rose in a shallow, fluttering gasp, and then it stopped. "No, no, no, no!" Luke rasped, dropping to his knees beside them. He scooped her up. Her little body was terrifyingly still, her weight a dead thing in his arms. He tilted her chin back, his hands trembling so violently he could barely function. "Pa!" Sam's voice cracked, thick with a horror no 9-year-old should ever know. Luke didn't have time to think. He only had time to act. He pressed his mouth over June's, forcing air from his own lungs into hers. Then he pushed down on her tiny chest with the heels of his hands, steady, desperate compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Come on, baby girl," he pleaded, his voice a raw, broken thing. "Come on, breathe for me. Breathe." Nothing. He kept going, the rhythm a frantic prayer. Breathe, breathe, breathe. The sound of his own heart hammered in his ears, so loud it drowned out the renewed crackle of gunfire from outside the shack. Sam was sobbing beside him, his small hands clutching at his father's arm. "Please, June," he wept. "Please wake up." And then it happened. A ragged, shallow gasp. June's tiny chest rose, shuddered, and then rose again on its own. It was the most beautiful sound Luke had ever heard. He let out a breath so sharp it was almost a sob himself. He gathered her into his arms, rocking her against his chest as her breathing slowly, miraculously, steadied. He pressed his face into her hair, inhaling the scent of her, reassuring himself that she was real, that she was alive. Sam pressed his forehead against her arm, his tears of terror slowly turning into tears of relief. "You stay with me, June," Luke whispered, his voice raw. "You hear me? You stay right here." The gunfire outside was still sporadic, but fierce. Luke forced himself to look up, his protective embrace around his daughter tightening. Through a splintered hole in the wall, he could see Mara. She was crouched behind the rusted water drum, the rifle braced against her shoulder. She was bleeding again, a fresh crimson stain soaking through the makeshift bandage on her arm, but she didn't seem to notice. She didn't falter. Her shots were calm, methodical, deadly. Each time she fired, one of the shouts from beyond the rubble-choked path was silenced. Eli, however, was still standing. He had been thrown back by the blast, his face a mess of dirt and fury, but he had somehow managed to climb his way through the treacherous, unstable rubble. He was a demon who refused to be sent back to hell. "Luke!" Mara bellowed, not taking her eyes off the target. "Watch the left!" He didn't need to. He saw Mara shift her aim with lightning speed, swinging the rifle just in time to drop a man who had been trying to find a flanking position around the rockfall. Eli let out a harsh, grating laugh. "You're running out of bullets, girl," he taunted. "I've still got enough for you," she shot back, her voice a snarl. That was Luke's cue. He gently set June down beside Sam. "Stay here," he commanded. He grabbed his own rifle and bolted from the relative safety of the shack, firing as he moved. His first shot was hurried, but it clipped Eli's shoulder, spinning him halfway around with the force of the impact. But the man didn't stop. He was fueled by a rage that seemed to make him immune to pain. He surged forward, abandoning his own rifle, swinging the butt of it like a heavy club. The wooden stock smashed into Mara's forearm with a sickening crack. Her rifle flew from her grasp. She cried out in pain, but it was a sound of anger, not defeat. She lunged at him, barehanded, a cornered animal fighting for its life. They hit the ground hard, rolling in the dirt and gravel. Eli, larger and stronger, quickly gained the upper hand. He pinned her beneath his weight, his fingers closing around her throat, squeezing the life from her. Luke sprinted forward, a roar of pure, primal fury tearing from his lungs. "Get off her!" He slammed into Eli with the force of a freight train. The two men tumbled across the dusty ground, a chaotic explosion of fists and boots and gritted teeth. Eli fought like a rabid animal, a man who had been waiting for this exact moment for 15 long years. "You think you can take what's mine, Avery?" He spat, blood running from a cut on his lip. "You think a broken-down little thing like her belongs to you?" Luke's fist cracked across Eli's jaw. "She doesn't belong to anyone!" he roared back. Eli's hand darted to his belt, closing around the hilt of a long hunting knife. The blade flashed in the sunlight as he drove it upward, aiming for Luke's ribs. Luke caught his wrist just in time, his muscles straining, biceps burning as he fought to keep the razor-sharp edge from plunging into his side. "Pa!" Sam screamed from the doorway of the shack. "Stay back, son!" Luke gritted out, his vision starting to blur from the strain. Eli twisted, a cruel, triumphant grin spreading across his bloody face. "She's not worth it, Luke! She never was!" Luke's rage surged, white-hot and absolute. "She was worth everything!" With a final, desperate roar, he forced Eli's hand away. He slammed Eli's head against the hard, rocky ground. Once, twice. He felt the man's resistance falter. On the third impact, Eli went limp. Luke staggered back, his chest heaving, sucking in great, ragged gulps of air. The knife clattered from Eli's slack fingers onto the dirt. Nearby, Mara coughed, rolling onto her side, her hand pressed to her bruised throat. "Took you long enough," she rasped, her voice a wreck. Luke stumbled over to her and offered her his hand. She stared at it for a long moment, her stormy eyes searching his. Then she took it, her grip surprisingly strong, and let him pull her to her feet. "You all right?" he asked, his voice still shaky. "I've been worse," she said. It was the truth. From beyond the rock slide, they could hear the sounds of the remaining men scrambling back down the ridge, dragging their wounded with them. The fight was over. The blast, and Mara's deadly aim, had broken them. Luke stood over Eli's unconscious body, the rifle heavy in his hands. "Are you going to kill him?" Mara asked quietly, coming to stand beside him. He stared down at the man who had hunted them, who had terrorized his children, who had nearly taken everything from him. For a long, silent moment, Luke didn't answer. The temptation was a dark, seductive whisper in his mind. End it. End him. Then, slowly, he slung the rifle back over his shoulder. "No," he said, his voice firm. "He lives. He lives with the knowledge that he lost. To you, to me, to a widower and a woman he thought was worthless." They worked quickly. Mara found some old rope in one of the shacks and bound Eli's hands and feet while Luke stood guard. They dragged his limp body to the edge of the rubble-choked trail and tied him securely to a stunted pine tree. He wouldn't bleed out, but he wouldn't be going anywhere soon. By the time they finished, the sun was sinking, painting the sky in soft, peaceful shades of pink and purple. Inside the shack, Sam sat with June curled up against him. He was feeding her small, broken pieces of a stale biscuit, his hands still shaking slightly. Luke knelt in front of them, his heart aching with a love so fierce it was almost painful. "You both did so good," he said softly. Sam looked up, his face still streaked with dirt and dried tears. "Is it over, Pa? Is it really over?" Luke glanced across the fire at Mara. Her expression was unreadable in the flickering light. "For now," Luke said finally. That night they stayed in the ruined camp. The fire burned low, a small pocket of warmth and light in a vast, cold wilderness. Luke sat with his back against the stone wall, June asleep in his arms, Sam curled up tightly against his side. Mara leaned against the opposite wall, her eyes half closed but as watchful as ever. After a long, comfortable silence, Luke spoke. "You never told me," he said, his voice quiet. "Your real name." Mara's gaze lifted to meet his, and for the first time, he saw her without the walls, without the armor. The defiance was gone, replaced by a deep, soul-shaking weariness. "Eden," she said softly, the name a whisper on the wind. "My name is Eden." Luke blinked. He felt the world tilt on its axis. His late wife's middle name, the name he had whispered to her on their wedding day, a secret just between them. It had been Eden. The fire popped, a soft, lonely sound. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. But something inside Luke shifted, a final piece of a puzzle he didn't even know he was solving sliding perfectly into place. She wasn't just a stranger he had bought for $3. She wasn't just a ghost from his past. In some strange, inexplicable way, she felt like the future. But as the wind rose outside, whispering through the pines like a warning, he knew this wasn't the end. A man like Eli Ward had allies. He had a memory, and he had a thirst for revenge. Luke Avery might have won the battle, but the war for his family, the war for his soul, was far from over. The morning broke with a brittle cold, frost clinging like a shroud to the stones of the ruined mining camp. Luke woke stiff and sore, every breath a fresh reminder of his cracked ribs, but the soft, warm weight of June sleeping in his arms was a grounding force, a silent promise that the nightmare was over. Her breathing was steady now, her tiny hand curled tightly in the fabric of his shirt. Across the embers of the dead fire, Mara, Eden, was already awake. She was crouched, her movements slow and deliberate as she tried to coax a few last sparks back to life. Her face was pale from blood loss and exhaustion, but her eyes were clear and alert. The guard never came down. Luke carefully passed a still sleeping June to Sam, who had curled up against him in the night, and pushed himself to his feet with a groan. He stepped out into the pale, early light and scanned the ridge below. The path was still a chaotic jumble of rock and dirt, the scar from their desperate gamble the night before. But something was wrong. The stunted pine tree where they had left Eli Ward was empty. The ropes lay in a heap on the ground, cut clean through. Luke felt his gut twist into a cold, hard knot. Someone had come for him. Eden appeared beside him, as silent as a shadow. She followed his gaze to the empty tree. "He's loose," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." A small voice came from the doorway of the shack behind them. "What happens now, Pa?" Luke turned slowly. His son stood there, June now clinging to his hand, the two of them looking like small, lost refugees against the vast, empty backdrop of the mountains. They looked far too old, their eyes holding a weary knowledge that no child should possess. Luke crouched down to their level, forcing a confidence he didn't feel into his voice. "Now," he said, looking from Sam to June, "we go home." Sam's brow furrowed. "But he'll come for us there." Luke put a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm. "I know," he said, "but running forever ain't no way to live. This is our land. We're not giving it up." Eden stepped closer, adjusting the rifle slung over her good shoulder. The makeshift bandage on her other arm was stained dark with dried blood. "He's not going to stop," she stated, her voice flat. "Men like him never do. His pride is a bigger wound than any bullet." Luke met her stormy gray eyes. For a moment, he saw the full, terrifying weight of what they were up against reflected there. Then he saw something else, a flicker of the same stubborn, unyielding resolve that burned in his own gut. "Then we won't stop either," he said. "We'll end it. For good." The journey down from the high ridge was a grim, silent affair. They moved through hidden game trails and steep wooded valleys that Eden knew by heart. She walked slightly ahead, a solitary, determined figure leading them back to the world they had fled. Watching her, Luke felt a pang of something he couldn't name. All those years apart, she had been forged into something new, something harder. A woman who survived because the world had given her no other choice. By mid-afternoon, they reached the edge of Luke's property. The ranch sat quiet in the distance. The fences were partially buried under old snowdrifts, and no smoke curled from the stone chimney. It looked abandoned, hollowed out, a ghost of what it had once been. Sam's hand tightened on the sleeve of Luke's coat. "It doesn't look like home anymore," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Luke put a heavy arm around his son's shoulders. "That's why we're here," he said, his voice a low growl. "To fix it." Stepping inside the cabin felt strange, like walking into a memory that didn't quite fit. A fine layer of dust covered the table. Tools were scattered on the floor where they'd been dropped in the panic of their escape. It was a snapshot of a moment of terror. Luke gently set June down by the cold hearth and knelt to build a fire. The simple, familiar task, a small comfort in the unsettling quiet. Without a word, Eden began to clear the table, moving through the small space with an efficiency that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. She set the room to rights, her movements calm and ordered, as if she were reclaiming it from the chaos that had invaded. Sam, following her lead, began to gather the scattered tools, stacking them neatly against the wall. As the fire caught and the room slowly filled with warmth and light, something in Luke's chest began to ease. The cabin was still damaged, still scarred, but it no longer felt broken. That night, after the children had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep, Luke sat at the table while Eden carefully cleaned and redressed the gash on her arm. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable. "You didn't have to come back," he said quietly, breaking the stillness. "You could have kept going, found somewhere safer." She didn't look up from her task. "I told you once before," she said, her voice soft. "I'm not leaving them." Luke studied her in the flickering firelight, the way it caught in her dark, tangled hair and highlighted the sharp, proud line of her jaw. "And me?" he asked, the words feeling heavy and important. She stilled for a moment, her hands pausing in their work. She set the clean cloth down and finally met his gaze. Her eyes were deep and clear, and for the first time, he felt like he could see all the way to the bottom of them. "And you," she said softly. The silence that followed was different. It was filled with unspoken things, with the weight of years and the promise of tomorrow. Finally, Luke cleared his throat. "I buried Clara on that hill," he said, nodding toward the window that faced the small, neglected orchard. "She deserved better. Better than the man I was back then." Eden's gaze was steady. "You're not that man anymore, Luke." He swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. "I want to be better," he confessed, the words raw and honest. "For them, and for you." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of her lips. "Then be better," she said simply. The days that followed were a strange mixture of peace and uneasy anticipation. It was a borrowed time, and they both knew it. Luke worked from sunup to sundown, repairing the fences, chopping a mountain of wood, securing the barn. Eden, meanwhile, brought life back into the cabin. She tended to the animals with a gentle hand and spent hours with the children. Luke would often pause in his work just to listen to the sound of her voice as she patiently taught June her first words, or the sound of Sam's quiet laughter as she showed him a trick for setting a rabbit snare. But the peace was a thin veneer over a constant, humming tension. Neither of them ever let their guard down. Luke's rifle was never more than an arm's length away. The first sign came one morning, a set of fresh tracks in the mud near the property line. Boot prints, not theirs. Eden spotted them first, crouching low to study their depth and stride. "He's close," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He's watching us." Luke felt her words land like a stone in his gut. The hunter was circling, patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. That night, as a soft, quiet snow began to fall. Luke tucked Sam and June into their beds. He lingered a little longer than usual, watching their peaceful, sleeping faces, memorizing every detail. Then he stepped back out into the main room. Eden was standing by the door, her own rifle slung across her back, a small pack of supplies at her feet. She was ready. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" she asked quietly, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside the window. Luke nodded grimly. "We can't wait for him to come to us. Not again. We end this tomorrow, on our terms." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. "Then tonight, we rest," she said. "It might be our last chance." They stood there for a long time, side by side, two solitary figures against the night, the cold of the room biting at their cheeks. Finally, slowly, Luke reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. She didn't pull away. The morning came sharp and still, the world blanketed in a fresh layer of white. Luke rose before dawn, leaving Eden and the children asleep by the hearth. He saddled his horse, checked his rifle for the dozenth time, and walked back inside. Sam was sitting at the table, his eyes wide and red-rimmed. He had been waiting. "You're going after him, aren't you?" the boy asked, his voice small but steady. Luke crouched down in front of him. "I am," he said, "but I'll be back, I promise." Sam stared at him for a long, heavy moment, a silent conversation passing between father and son. Then he gave a single, sharp nod. "Bring her back too," he said, his gaze flicking toward the sleeping form of Eden. Luke's throat tightened. "I will." A moment later, Eden stepped out of the cabin, already dressed for the ride. She looked from Luke to the saddled horse and back again. "You didn't really think you were going without me, did you, Luke Avery?" He didn't even bother to argue. He knew it would be pointless. They mounted up and rode out together, leaving the sleeping children and the quiet ranch behind them. The rising sun cast long, dark shadows across the snow-covered land. Neither of them spoke. They both knew there was no turning back now. This was the end of the road, one way or another. By midday, they found what they were looking for, a single set of tracks leading up from the valley and into the dense pine forest that bordered Luke's property. They followed them on foot, leaving their horses tethered in a hidden grove. The forest was eerily silent, the snow muffling every sound. Luke felt it before he saw anything, a subtle shift in the air, the kind of tension that comes just before a storm breaks. Eden slowed, her hand tightening on her rifle, her eyes scanning the trees. "He's here," she whispered. A voice echoed through the pines, startling a flock of crows into a noisy, chaotic flight. "You should have stayed gone, Avery." Eli Ward stepped out from behind a large tree about 50 yards away. He looked gaunt, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes burned with a feverish, hateful light. His rifle was already in his hands. "You came back for her," he said, his lip curling into a sneer as he nodded toward Eden. "Should have known. You always did have a weakness for broken things." Luke didn't rise to the bait. He stood his ground, his own rifle held steady. "Funny, Eli," he said, his voice cold and calm. "You always had a weakness for losing." Eli's grin widened, a terrible, ugly thing. "Let's finish this." He lifted his rifle. Luke lifted his. And in the profound, waiting silence of the winter forest, the world held its breath. The first shot was like a clap of thunder, its echo rolling through the silent, snow-laden trees. Luke dove sideways on pure instinct, a spray of snow and bark exploding from the spot where he had been standing a split second before. Eli's bullet had buried itself deep in the trunk of a massive pine. Eden moved with a grace and speed that defied her old wounds. She dropped low, using a fallen log for cover, her eyes sharp and focused, her movements economical and precise. She returned fire, the crack of her own rifle controlled and steady. The shot was close, grazing Eli's coat sleeve, close enough to make him curse and stumble back behind the relative safety of another tree. Luke rolled, his boots digging into the snow for traction, and came up on one knee. He aimed, fired. Splinters of wood burst from the tree shielding Eli, but the man was safe. A wild, sharp laugh cut through the woods. "You think you can beat me, Avery? You don't have the stomach for it. You never did." Luke's jaw clenched. He slid behind a thicket of young trees, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He wasn't the same man Eli had known 15 years ago. He was fighting for Sam, for June, for Eden. Across the clearing, Eden glanced his way. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments, but it was enough. No words were needed. The message was as clear as the cold winter air. "One of us has to end this." Eli fired again, the bullet singing past Eden's ear with a vicious hum. She flinched, but didn't falter. Luke used the opportunity to move, circling wide, his boots crunching softly in the deep snow. The fight became a brutal, tense chess match. Eli was cunning, constantly shifting his position, never allowing himself to be pinned down. But Luke knew this land better. He knew its secrets, its dips and hollows. He circled wider, using the terrain to his advantage, forcing Eli to fall back toward a narrow, snow-filled gully. It was a trap. Eli took one step back, and his foot sank deep into the soft, treacherous snowdrift that concealed the gully's edge. He was off balance just for a second. It was the only opening Luke needed. He surged forward, abandoning his rifle, and slammed into Eli with all his weight. The two men went down hard, tumbling into the snow, their fight becoming a primal, desperate struggle. Eli struck first, a hard fist cracking against Luke's jaw. Pain exploded, white-hot behind Luke's eyes, but he barely felt it. He grappled, his teeth gritted, his hands searching for Eli's knife hand. "Luke!" Eden's voice was a sharp cry from the edge of the gully. The knife flashed. Eli drove the blade down, and Luke felt a searing, tearing pain as it bit deep into the flesh of his shoulder. He roared, a sound of pure agony and rage, but he didn't let go. He grabbed Eli's wrist, wrenching it with all his remaining strength. The knife clattered free, disappearing into the white depths of the snow. Eli swung again, his fists wild, but Luke blocked the blow with his forearm and drove his own fist square into Eli's jaw. Once, twice. The third blow sent Eli sprawling backward into the snow, blood streaming from his nose and mouth. He lay there, gasping, beaten, but he wasn't dead. Luke staggered to his feet, his chest heaving, hot blood seeping down his arm and staining the pristine snow a dark crimson. He snatched up Eli's fallen rifle and aimed it at the man on the ground. Eden reached him then, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Luke," she said, her voice soft but firm. He didn't look at her. His finger rested on the trigger. "You kill him," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper, "and you become him. You'll never stop looking over your shoulder." "But if I don't," Luke rasped, the pain in his shoulder a blinding fire, "he'll come back. He'll never stop." Eli let out a weak, bloody laugh. "She's right, Avery," he spat. "You're damn right I'll come back." Luke stared down at the broken man for a long, heavy moment. He saw the hate in Eli's eyes, a bottomless well of it, and he saw his own reflection there. He saw the man he could become if he pulled that trigger. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the rifle. "You'll rot in the sheriff's jail," he said, his voice as cold as the grave. "You'll grow old and die there, forgotten. That's a fate worse than anything I could give you now." Eli's eyes widened in disbelief as Luke stepped back. Eden didn't argue. She helped Luke bind Eli's hands and feet with his own belt, dragging him to a nearby tree and tying him so tightly he could barely move. "You ain't seen the last of me, Avery," Eli snarled through his bloodied teeth. Luke met his gaze, his own eyes steady and clear. "Yes, I have," he said. "You already lost." They left him there for the sheriff's men to find. The ride home was quiet, the world around them softened by the gently falling snow. Luke's shoulder burned with every jarring step of his horse, but Eden's steady, reassuring presence beside him seemed to dull the pain. When the ranch finally came into view, the door to the cabin burst open. Sam ran out, with June held tightly in his arms. "You came back!" Sam shouted, his voice breaking with relief. Luke slid from the saddle, his legs barely holding him. Sam barreled into him, hugging him so tightly it sent a fresh wave of pain through his shoulder. He didn't care. June wriggled free, her small arms reaching up for her father. Luke knelt in the snow, pulling both of his children into his arms, despite the agony it caused. "It's over," he whispered into their hair. "We're safe now." Eden dismounted slowly, watching the three of them with a strange, soft expression on her face that Luke had never seen before. Sam turned to her, his eyes wide with a question that held the weight of the world. "Are you staying?" Eden froze for a moment. She glanced at Luke. He didn't speak. He just held her gaze, his heart in his throat, waiting. Her lips, which had been set in a grim line for so long, curved into the smallest, quietest of smiles. "If you'll have me," she said. Sam's grin was so wide it looked like it hurt. June, still holding her father's hand, reached out her other hand for Eden's. Eden took it. That night, after the children were asleep, Luke stood at the window, staring out at the moonlit, snow-covered hills. His arm was in a sling, his body ached, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. Eden came to stand beside him, her presence a warm, solid comfort in the cool night air. "You could have killed him," she said softly. "I thought about it," he admitted, "but you didn't." Luke glanced at her, at the woman who had fought beside him, who had saved his children, who had saved him. "Because of you," he said. Eden tilted her head slightly, her gray eyes searching his. "What now, Luke Avery?" He took a deep breath, the weight of the past finally, truly, beginning to lift. He turned to face her fully. "Now," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "we build something better." Her eyes searched his for a long moment. And then, for the first time, she smiled back. A real smile. It was small, but it was certain, and it held the promise of 1,000 sunrises. If you found this story of survival and justice as gripping as I did, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss the next tale we uncover from the shadows.